Hello and welcome to the Point Blank Show. My name is Abhishek. Almost all of you listening to this podcast would be living in a democratic country. Dr. Marcus Dersis has dedicated over a decade to study the other side, how dictators work. His latest book, How Tyrants Fall and How Nations Survive, is a result of deep research. He spent hours and hours with diplomats, journalists, dissidents, human rights activists, and former spies. What follows is a brilliant account of how a tyrant goes about his business and what can be done to stop him, if at all that is possible. Thank you very much, Marcus, for your time on the podcast. Thanks for joining in.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. And this subject is quite a serious one and not a laughing matter at all. But one of my friends last year recommended this movie called The Dictator. It's a 2012 movie. I'm not sure if you've watched it. Have you? It's a comedy film. It's got Sacha Baron Cohen, who's this brilliant comedian, and he plays the role of a fictional dictator of a fictional Republic of Adia, and he does some silly, outrageous things in the movie, like asking people, his team, to build a rocket that is more pointy rather than blunt, because pointy is scary. And I thought at first that this is taking it to some ridiculous extreme, but after having read your book, not quite. I mean, can you give a few examples as to the eccentricities of some of these mad men in charge of big countries?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've seen some clips of the movie. I haven't actually watched the movie outright, but it is accurate to say that there are some dictators and other tyrants that behave in deeply strange ways. You look at them and you think they've totally lost their mind. So one of the examples from Central Asia actually is a dictator who wrote a kind of self-help crossover holy book and then basically made everybody in the country study it. So school children had to study it. Even government officials had to study it. There are dictators that have built a golden statue of themselves that rotates with the sun. You've got people being blown up with anti-aircraft guns for falling asleep in a meeting. So there are all types of things that we look at and we think, gosh, what on earth is going on?
Yeah, and the person that you talk about is Kim Jong-un, right, of North Korea, who basically had one of his folks executed because he slept at a meeting. And I found it amusing that there was, but not it must be quite serious down there, but they could summon an aeronautics engineer to fix his toy planes, and the guy had to come because otherwise he'd probably be shot dead. So it's quite crazy.
Yeah, it is in a way. And, you look at people like that and you have to wonder what that does to a man's or a child's psyche in that sense. And, talking about Kim Jong-un in particular, he grew up in power. So unlike some of these other people, he didn't take it when he was already some sort of functioning adult. But from the very beginning of his life, he was in an environment where people had to bow down to him, in some cases figuratively and in other cases literally. And obviously that does something to a person. And there's a journalist speaking about Kim Jong-un who said something like, when we're children, all of us have this situation where we are treated as the center of the universe. But for the vast majority of us, that stops when we get older. But for somebody like Kim Jong-un, it never did. He still is the center of the universe, but now not just in his little family, but in an entire country.
And you yourself had a brush with tyranny when you were working, was it in the Democratic Republic of Congo? Tell us about it. When was that first time? And it wasn't very safe, to say the least.
Yeah, when I was doing my bachelor's in international politics, I told myself that I would not do a master's. And then I did a master's degree. And then, while I was doing that, I said, okay, look, I'm done. I'm done with libraries. I don't want to read books anymore all day, every day. I want to see the world. So what I ended up doing was going to work in the Democratic Republic of Congo for a brewery, which was perhaps not the most usual choice after doing a master's degree. And as you can imagine, my family was not exactly thrilled when I told them that I was going to go work in Central Africa. In the book, I think the way I put it was to say that, the most valuable lessons I learned there weren't about hops or barley or anything related to beer, really. Because one day what happened was that there was an attack in Kinshasa, in the capital of the Congo. And, initially it was very difficult to find out really what was happening because I was in Lubumbashi on the other side of the country. So very far away and, what I thought may be safe from whatever was going on in Kinshasa. And, I tried to find out what was going on. It was very difficult because nobody really knew. And eventually I decided to just go back to work after my lunch break. And normally this would be one of the nicer parts of the day. You know, my little bungalow was in the same compound as the brewery. So I would walk and, you know, I would look at these nice big palm trees and there'd be exotic birds, you know, flying overhead. But on that day, what happened is I heard a shot, like a loud bang. And I was like, okay. And then all of a sudden I heard another shot and then another shot. And there was shooting coming from 3 directions. And then all of a sudden an even louder, like an actual explosion. And at that point, you know, all of us would like to think that, you know, we're brave. But at that point, you know, I was in a slight panic. You know, I went and, you know, talked to a colleague of mine and I said, what are we going to do? I mean, what on earth is happening? And, you know, they had heard the shots, but they had heard shots before and previously nothing too bad had happened. So the answer was nothing. We're going to do nothing. And that day has stuck with me ever since, because I thought to myself, you know, how can it be that some countries experience this type of political instability with such regularity that many people have almost grown numb to it? And later on, what I found out is that there was a coup attempt in Kinshasa against the government. So a public broadcasting studio was stormed, the country's main airport was attacked, and a military base was also attacked. And then the fighting that happened in Lubumbashi that I could hear was the government's troops against the people that had planned the coup. And they had a church of some kind in Lubumbashi. So, you know, after that, I kind of changed course. And I said, okay, it is what it is. This is what I'm supposed to do. I am going back to university. I am going to do a PhD. And ever since then, I've been obsessed with this topic. You know, how do these leaders stay in power? What are the mechanisms that they try to exploit? And what happens when they lose it?
How did that phone call go back to your family in Germany that evening when this happened?
So the question that I always faced when I was in the Congo is something would happen, and then I would have to try to figure out whether I would make the evening news in Germany. Because if I thought it did, then I would have to call, because if they found out from the evening news and they haven't heard from me, it's bad. But if you calculate that it doesn't make the evening news, then perhaps it's better to not make that phone call, because you don't want to worry people needlessly.
Yes. And your folks, or meaning your colleagues, did not worry at all. They told you table number 2 needs 2 pints of beer. Go do that, because this is happening every day. I mean, people get inured to these things, basically, don't they?
Yeah, I mean,
in that environment.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, look, I mean, like, as a sort of visitor, obviously I was in a very privileged position because, you know, I was in a compound, I was behind these high walls. So, you know, the ordinary shooting itself wasn't really going to be an issue for me. But when I heard that big explosion, I thought, well, you know, this could be anything. This could be a mortar round, this could be an RPG. And if this is the type of level we're approaching now, you know, that could be a concern for us as well. And the added problem was, you know, flying wasn't going to be an option because the airports were closed. And I was well over 1,000 kilometers away from the German embassy in Kinshasa. So, you know, you're not exactly in a place, you know, that's not a great place to be when crisis strikes. But in the end, I think, yeah, you do grow numb to it. And that also makes sense because I think it's a defense mechanism, you know. I mean, it's not like the Congo experiences a coup attempt every day. But if you have these kinds of events with some regularity, you need to be able to go on with life, because otherwise you come to a complete paralysis. But that, of course, is odd for people that come from countries where this sort of thing doesn't happen.
And one of the misconceptions that I had, and which was busted after reading your book, is that I always felt dictators have a cool life. We've got the likes of Robert Mugabe, who died at 95. Gaddafis of the world stayed in power for 30 years. They can have sex with anybody. They can have anybody murdered. But not quite. It looks like they are in constant fear of being taken out themselves. Can you tell us about the life of a tyrant?
Yeah. So I think this is a pretty common misconception. You know, people think, oh, they sit in their palace. They can pretty much do whatever they want. They're super wealthy. And some of that is true. A lot of the people are incredibly wealthy, oftentimes even the wealthiest people in their entire country. But one of the key differences between a democracy and these types of tyrannical regimes is what happens to leaders once they lose power. So if you're a German chancellor, or, you know, you're a UK prime minister or something along those lines, you're the head of a democracy. When you lose power, you're probably going to be okay. Right? You might spend some time golfing, or maybe you enjoy retirement with your family, or perhaps you give speeches to banks. So you're going to be fine. But if you're a dictator, your outlook is very, very different. So when political scientists looked at what happens to personalist dictators, the types of leaders with most power in their hands, they found that more than 2/3 of them are forced into exile, they end up in jail, or they get killed. More than 2/3. So the odds of a tranquil retirement for dictators are worse than a coin flip. And, obviously, if you're a Gaddafi or, if you're any of these types of tyrants, yeah, you might have not read that statistical analysis. You might not be big on reading academic articles, but it is something that these people feel. And the added complication comes when you realize that the structure of these regimes is also very different. So one of the ways to think about a dictatorship as opposed to democracy is the share of the population that you need in order to take power or to maintain power. So if we go to a place like, let's say, India, if you want to take power in India or you want to maintain power, you require a large share of the population because you need to win elections. And well, in India, obviously, it's also in absolute numbers. It's a lot of people. But the share is also very large. And that's the case for every functioning democracy. But when you get to a place like Kim Jong-un's North Korea, Kim Jong-un may only need, 100 or 200 families in order to maintain power. And that sounds good at first because you think, well, if you only need those 200 families of, soldiers or intelligence officials, that means you can ignore just about everybody else. And to a large extent, that's true. But there's a flip side of that. And that flip side often traps dictators. Because if you're a democratic leader, you can afford to lose a lot of people and still maintain power. But if you're Kim Jong-un and you lose 50 families, you lose 100 families, you are probably going to lose power. And then when you lose power, you might not just lose power, but you may also lose your freedom and also your life. It's a terrifying existence.
Right, and to prevent themselves from being killed brutally, if that day ever comes, these dictators go to great lengths. You write about Gaddafi having 4-meter high compound walls with 1 meter thick. He had there were tunnels with television sets in them so he could address a country if he were under siege, an operating theater if he were to get bruised or battered during such. So it's a lot of planning goes into just being in power, rather than spending money on the population who really will not, it's not even in their framework to please the population at all, is there? Because that population is not going to vote them into power, so they may as well save themselves. So it's a simple math, but a difficult one.
Looking after the population at large is actively detrimental to dictators. Not only is it kind of a waste of resources or a waste of money, it is actively going to hurt them because they need that money and they need that power to give to the people that actually keep them where they are. So, that's going to be your generals, that's going to be your oligarchs. These are the types of people that they need to look after. And this is where democracies have a structural advantage. Obviously, democracies aren't perfect. A lot of things that, in our systems are annoying. Sometimes things move very slowly. But in our systems, leaders have a structural incentive to look after a large share of the population. And that makes us, by and large, better and more sustainable than dictatorships.
And you write something around the golden gun paradox. Can you explain what that is in that context that you just spoke?
So in these types of regimes, in dictatorships, the line between seeming stability and absolute chaos is extremely narrow. Because there's very little legitimacy. There's oftentimes not a greater project. There's nothing that people really believe in. To the extent that they support the dictatorship, they often do it because they think the dictatorship is inevitable. So opposing it is irrational and in many cases also extremely risky. Nobody wants to bet on the loser if betting on the loser can mean going to a gulag or worse. So what you have in these regimes is that, these dictators, they have all these symbols of power. They've got these soldiers standing by. They're seemingly in control of the armed forces. And in the case of Gaddafi, he had a gun literally made of gold. So it was allegedly given to him by one of his sons, and it had all these intricate engravings. It was the ultimate symbol of power that you could possibly have. But at the moment when he could have used it most, which is when he was captured by rebels, it didn't do anything for him. Because the gun itself is useless. All of these symbols of power are ultimately useless once people no longer believe that the dictator is going to stay in power. And that's why Sometimes you look at a regime, let's say Assad Syria, and you think, well, it's going to survive for another 10 years. And then, a day later, soldiers are just taking off their uniforms, throwing them by the side of the road, and they're done with the regime, and subsequently the regime is done.
Yeah, and that happened quite quickly, didn't it? I think it was November 27th when rebels took the second city of Aleppo. In December first week, they went to the next city, and it all happened in very quick time. Within 2 weeks, the Assad regime, as we know it, was gone, and I think he's absconding now. So these things can also accelerate in no time. And Assad went to Russia, Iran, Jordan, among others, to seek help, but nobody wanted to fight with him or for him. So despite keeping people happy, when things go south, they go south very fast.
Exactly. That's the risk. And that's why sometimes it can also be so difficult from the outside when you look at these regimes to really tell where they are. A regime can seem incredibly stable, but really what you're looking at is a sort of dictatorial mirage where, all you have is that impression. But obviously the regime is very opaque, so you can't really look inside people's heads. There's not much transparency. Independent information is suppressed. So that's why oftentimes people get it so wrong. And, you got to have sympathy with experts on that sometimes, because it genuinely is really difficult to tell.
Yeah, and one of the techniques that these dictators use, I was reading an article in The Economist. They talked about Congo, where you lived. Was it Mobutu Sese Seko, who ruled Congo for 32 years? He was notorious for changing his ministers like playing musical chairs. I think he shuffled them around, and the whole idea was, if you were a minister, you would be on a ministerial post, you would go to prison, then exile, and then you would return to office back up, because and this usually would happen in the fourth year, apparently, where they would get a little more powerful, and he would quickly move them around.
Yeah. So the primary threat to most of these leaders are not the masses in the streets or some kind of external enemy, but their own people. So in the book, I think the way I put it is, the people smiling at them in the palace as they walk by. So their closest advisors, their own generals, their own intelligence officials. These are the people that ultimately present the biggest threat. And knowing this, as a leader, you have to take care of these people immediately. If you don't take care of these people, you're done. So you try to take care of these people, and that can take a number of ways, right? So one thing that you can do is to give these people power. You can give them money to try to keep them on your side. But, there's not just a carrot, but there's also the stick. So obviously you can use repression in order to swap out people that might be disloyal and so forth. And yeah, like you say, structure also plays a really big part. So you don't want people to be able to coordinate against you. You don't want your ministers to spend too much time together, especially not if they're related to the security forces in some way. So if you see the Minister of the Interior with your big general going golfing or something, that's not the type of thing you want. Yeah. And in fact, the military is one of the prime problems for all of these leaders. So one thing that almost every I don't want to say good dictator. One thing that almost every effective dictator does is to change the structure of their security services. So instead of having a unified military under the command of one general, what you want to have as a dictator is you have your regular military, then you have a parallel military force, and then maybe you also have a militarized palace guard. And the reason why you want to do this is because you want to signal to your generals that they couldn't just depose you one day if they decide that they would rather be in charge. They need to think that they would have to go through a large militia, for example, in order to make it to the palace, or through that militarized palace guard. And knowing that they would have to fight to depose you, they will be less likely to actually try to depose you. But just like everything else in politics, you've got a trade-off here, right? So if you're a dictator, you can only really change the threat around, but you can't really resolve it. It's inherent in your position. So if you structure your security services in a way that makes it less likely that you will be pushed away, you have now created security forces that are going to be less good at the actual job, which is fighting wars. Because that unified command structure is extremely good if you have to defend the country against some sort of external attack. So this is an example for these trade-offs. You can either coup-proof your military, or you can have an effective fighting force, but you can't have both.
And have any dictators, through your study, done this very effectively, not so much for the audience or his subjects, but for himself?
Yeah, extremely effectively. You see it really throughout history. I mean, perhaps the latest example of something like this would be Vladimir Putin. So, listeners may remember what happened when Prigozhin, the head of Wagner, instead of marching on Ukraine, decided to go the other way towards Moscow, right? So this is an example where Vladimir Putin was worried about his own military. So he structured it in a way that he would have a counterweight against the regular forces, which in this case was Wagner, so mercenaries. And that worked for a while, but then eventually the monster that he had created almost came back to bite him and depose him from power because Prigozhin decided that, Moscow should be the destination and not Kiev. So Putin is a recent example, and he was unlucky. But there were plenty of dictators where this worked out for a while. But sometimes it then became apparent to them that they had gone almost too far in coup-proofing because the external threat became bigger. So one of the examples that I go through in the book is the example of Saddam Hussein. So Saddam Hussein was infamous for this, and not just with the military, but also with the intelligence services. So, Iraq was about to go to war against Iran. So Iran was a massive problem. And even though everybody in Baghdad knew that Iran was a massive problem, even at that point when tensions were, boiling, Saddam Hussein was still more worried about his own military than the Iranian military. So instead of using his intelligence services to spy on the Iranians, almost everybody in the entire Iraqi intelligence service was occupied with either spying on ordinary Iraqis or the Iraqi military. Three Iraqi intelligence officers were tasked with spying on Iran, which was Iraq's biggest external threat. Right. And he didn't just do that. I mean, he promoted for loyalty. He had the whole coup-proofing going on. He would even decide how wide individual trenches were supposed to be. But then eventually what happened was that the Iranians gained the upper hand. So partly because of all this micromanaging and all this coup-proofing going on, the Iranians were pushing and pushing and pushing. And Saddam Hussein realized that, okay, wait a minute. Actually, the Iranian soldiers are perhaps a bigger issue than the Iraqi soldiers. Right. So I'm going to dial it back on some of the coup-proofing. I'm going to try to listen to my generals a bit more because they are the actual professionals. And in the end, that was enough to save it. But once again, you can only really turn it up or turn it down, but the problem is going to be somewhere. You're always going to be at risk.
So these guys are always paranoid, aren't they? You talked about micromanagement. There's another example you give of Yasser Arafat, who would sign, $300 worth of checks as small as those to his paramilitary unit. So there is a lot of, they don't sleep at night, do they? They don't get a good night's sleep is what I would imagine. And that serves them well, if that is the case.
Yeah, I think, a lot of the psychological qualities that these leaders have would be detrimental to normal people. So, if you work in an office cubicle, having the psychological makeup of a dictator would be terrible because you would not be able to function. But of course, these people do not have normal jobs. So just to give one example, these are people that have to either threaten or actively use brutal violence pretty regularly. And to be able to do that and to still get some sort of sleep, you have to be damaged in a sense. And the same goes for that paranoia. They have to be paranoid because if you aren't paranoid, then you are going to lose power because, unlike for the cubicle worker, for the dictator, the threat is actually real and it is actually lurking around every corner. And yet what I argue in the book is that these people are rational within the system in which they operate. So when you look at somebody like Putin, right? Using missiles to attack a Ukrainian children's hospital, you see that and you think this man has totally lost it. He has to be completely insane. But within the system in which he operates, the violence, the repression, the treachery, all of it makes sense because the killing and the torture is a way to maintain power. And the problem is, seen from the dictatorial palace, that if you lose that rationality, if you do become divorced from reality, you are no longer able to make the trade-offs that you need to make in order to maintain power. So in the book, an example that I gave is Macias Nguema, who was a dictator in West Africa during the Cold War. And this guy completely lost his mind. And I'm not saying that figuratively, but he became completely delusional. He could no longer differentiate between, fact and fiction. And there are anecdotes that he would walk around his palace screaming out the names of the people that he had killed. And in one episode, he would ask his servants to lay the table for 8 guests. But nobody arrived. And yet, he spent the evening talking to his 8 guests as if they were there, but he was all alone. So what happens in a situation like this? Once you are no longer able to make these trade-offs, and once you are no longer able to actually differentiate between friends and foes, he just lashed out and he started killing at random. And then very quickly, the people around him that kept him in power decided, you know what, if there's no difference being made between people that are loyal and people that are not loyal, we need to get rid of him as quickly as we possibly can. And that's what he did. And they shot him.
So, I mean, insane. He just went insane. And sometimes I wonder, because the nuclear weapon is only one switch away, and the risks are quite real with the likes of Putin or, Kim Jong-un. How can foreign powers, say, or adversaries predict what these quote-unquote madmen can do? Do they deploy psychologists to see, or do they have spies that, how is he thinking? How is his mental state? Which side of the bed did he wake up from that morning? Because you never know, it could go either way. Despite they being part of a system, one fine day, if you have an argument with your spouse, for all you know, they might do something silly.
Outsiders try to look at the psychology of these leaders, because the more power you have concentrated in the hands of just one man, the more important it becomes what's going on inside his head. So there's a massive interest from the outside trying to understand what on earth is going on. So in the book, I cite an example of a psychologist called Dr. Post, and he spent the majority of his life trying to do exactly that. So, the American government would ask him to try to come up with psychological profiles of these leaders because they wanted to anticipate what they might do. So one of the people that he looked at, for example, was Saddam Hussein, because the government of the United States wanted to know, okay, if he's under pressure, what is he going to do? Is he still rational? Is his primary aim survival, or is he looking for the greatness of Iraq? What might he do? Does he want to be a martyr? So outsiders do look at that, and psychology is a big factor. But since you mentioned nuclear weapons in particular, structure is another. So one of the terrifying things that I have in the book is the example of North Korea. So by and large, dictators are not interested in designating a successor, because the moment that you designate a successor, you almost hand a dagger to somebody who now has a big interest in seeing you fall. There are some exceptions, but by and large, this is how it works. So imagine now, you're Kim Jong-un, you're a nuclear weapon state, and you don't have an interest in creating a successor, because creating a successor puts your rule at risk. What would happen if, let's say, conflict escalates between South Korea and North Korea, and for some reason, Kim Jong-un is nowhere to be found? He can't be contacted, maybe communication systems are down, whatever. In the case of the United States, if this were to happen, power would then move from the president to the vice president. So there's a mechanism to deal with this eventuality. What the North Koreans did is they created almost an automatic system whereby if their leader can no longer be reached, power isn't delegated, but they just send the nukes. And that's especially dangerous because the South Koreans are judging that since Kim Jong-un doesn't really care about the vast majority of North Koreans because they're irrelevant to his power, if conflict were to escalate with North Korea, they would have to find something else that Kim Jong-un might care about, and that is his life. So if you have that escalation of conflict, the South Koreans would try to find Kim Jong-un and kill him. And Kim Jong-un knows that. So he would have to assume that anything that may happen in his vicinity, any rockets, anything that comes in, would be directed at him, even though it might not be. Perhaps the South Koreans are just going for an ammunition depot or something like that. So you've got all these structural and psychological factors that make it incredibly dangerous when just one person has all this power.
Yeah, now that you say about psychologists, recently with what's happening after Trump got elected, and he just called Zelensky a dictator a few days ago, and apparently Ukrainian officials, and let me get this right, the sentence, there was to quote the Economist's more recent article, they said, Ukrainian officials say their encounters with Mr. Trump's team are so confusing that they have been watching documentaries for clues about his negotiation style, unquote. Now here I'm not suggesting that Trump is a dictator, but that they use psychologists to, try and figure out what's going on in the man's head. And here's a person who's coming from a democratic background, the ones like the Saddam Husseins of the world, you never know what they're thinking on the day that they wake up. And do some of them also stage false coups to see, let me see who's on my side, who's not on my side. Just to keep it's like a drill, and that also has to be done like a game of chess, I would imagine, because that could also backfire for all you know.
So one of the big problems that dictators have is that they never really know who's actually loyal and who's just pretending to be. Because if you dislike the dictator, you're not going to tell him, and you will be reluctant to tell him the truth. So if something bad happens in a battle, or the harvest is bad, or whatever else it might be, you do not want to be the person to deliver that bad news to the dictator. And as a result of that, it becomes very difficult for these dictators to actually tell what is going on. You know, that they might not actually have that much of a clear picture of their very own country, which is problematic because it invites mistakes. So one of the things that, I talk about in the book is, Putin as well. Putin probably generally thought that they could take Kiev very, very quickly because the people around him would have told him, look, if we get to Ukraine, it's going to be no issue. People there are waiting for us. They're not going to fight and so forth. Because this is a system in which that perceived loyalty is rewarded over and over again. And if you are critical, you're going to get punished. You're going to get demoted. You might go to jail. So over time, you surround yourself with people that will essentially lie to you, or at the very least omit critical information. So you have this dictator's dilemma, and it is very difficult to break out of. One of the few exceptions that dictators can have are moments of extreme crises. So when a coup attempt is underway, this is a brief moment in time at which you can see through the fog clearly, and you get an accurate picture of who is genuinely with you and who is opposing you. But the issue, of course, is that it's incredibly volatile. And if you bring it about on purpose, then you can actually lose power. So it's a very risky play.
Yeah. And about that point you made about fear, you also write about some general was it 1943, around the time of the siege of Leningrad, where the Russian general was too afraid to tell Moscow that they were losing terribly. But he made up stories of how it was going well and it was fierce battle, because if he took that, he would be shot, because shoot the messenger was quite common in the day. So that fear translates to, it's all inefficient, and it doesn't help in any way then.
Yeah, I think, many of us have this idea that dictatorships are necessarily better at fighting wars than democracies. And it is true that dictatorships have some advantages. And one of them is a casualty sensitivity. So when democratic countries experience casualties because their soldiers get shot and, they either die or they get severely injured, that is a big, big problem for democratic leaders, because these are the people that these democratic leaders depend upon in order to maintain power, right? Voters, just ordinary voters. And these soldiers have families and they have friends, and, they might oppose the democratic leaders, so that's an issue. If you're a personalist dictator, that's not really much of a concern, right? I mean, if a poor person from a Siberian village dies in Ukraine, it's not an issue for Putin. It's fine, because that Siberian village is completely irrelevant to the question of whether Putin maintains his power or not. And that's the same not just for Russia. It's the same for North Korea and all of these other dictatorships as well. But there are other things where dictatorships have a severe disadvantage. And one of them you just mentioned. Oftentimes in these systems, generals are more afraid of their own regime than they would be of the enemy. And they are almost in an impossible situation, because if they are seen to be failing, they might get shot. And if they are doing too well, they might also get shot. Because if they do too well and they keep winning, then they could become a threat to the leader. And that's not going to be looked upon very kindly by that leader. So it is a big, big disadvantage.
That is a job description. If it's put out, it's like nobody will put their hand up, but there are enough people who do. I wonder why. Is it because better to be that general than to be the common man who doesn't get food on the table?
That's, I think, part of the story. So, people often ask me, why would you want to be that general, or why would you want to be that dictator, if it's so terrible? But I think one thing that we have to remember is that the alternative is oftentimes not that the country would be a flourishing democracy. There would still be a dictator. It would just be somebody else. So if you already live in a dictatorship, you might as well be that guy if the alternative is, taking orders from him.
And one of the grim things that I read in the book is that toppling a tyrant is no guarantee that the country is going to do well. And the statistics are overwhelmingly against this conception that, you get a dictator down, things will run on autopilot. It has almost rarely happened.
Yeah, so again, there's a structural element here. So one of the things that dictators tend to do is to destroy the institutions within their country. And they don't like institutions because these institutions are constraints. So you don't want to have a functioning court system. You don't want to have an independent civil service. You don't want to have any of that. So you try to destroy them as much as you possibly can. And like you said, oftentimes these people are in power for a long time. So if you have 3 decades, you can destroy a lot of stuff. So at that moment, when the dictator then goes because he dies or he's toppled, oftentimes there's no real mechanism to even organize succession. And all of a sudden, you're left in a scenario where, the whole thing could go up completely in flames. There might be civil war, there might be another dictatorship and so forth. So yes, oftentimes personalist dictatorships are just followed by more dictatorships. And another element to this are the interests of the regime elites. So if you are one of these advisors or you're one of these generals or intelligence officials, what you care about is not so much the individual dictator, but the survival of the regime itself, because it's the regime that gives you your power and the regime that gives you your money. So when the dictator falls asleep, you're not going to be pushing for a democracy because democracy is diametrically opposed to your interests. What you want is another dictator because that is the way to ensure that money keeps flowing.
Yep. And the stats, just for the listeners, you write you've got 20% of fallen autocratic leaders from 1950 to 2012 were followed by a democracy. Just 1/5. And again, to quote you, barely 1 in 10 US regime change operations over a century ended up in democracy. But I also wanted to ask you this. On one hand, you see a country doing all those atrocities, or the dictator bringing that to his subjects. On the other hand, a country like America, say, these days the mantra is the world's problems are not America's problems, etc. But that wasn't always the case. There have been even the likes of Colin Powell have given a thumbs up to helping a country like Uzbekistan, which had a terrible dictator, so that might help them in the war against Afghanistan. What is that line? It says there are no common friends, only mutual interests, or there is some line, isn't it? So is that how it comes down to all the time?
When democratic leaders go on TV, they say that they're primarily interested in democracy. But when it comes to actually making these decisions, then democracy is really usually not enough in order to motivate an outside intervention. Because what we have to remember is that oftentimes these outside interventions are incredibly costly, both in terms of blood and also treasure. So if you're a democratic leader trying to justify to your people that you're going to go to war and you have these young men and women coming back in coffins because they get shot, you need a very, very good reason. And usually the only thing that's good enough as a reason is national security. So that's why these leaders might say that they will intervene somewhere because they want to promote democracy. But usually the real argument is somehow related to national security. And then the other interesting thing about these outside interventions is when they actually would make sense and how costly they are relative to your chances of success. So the problem is, as an outside power, is that the countries that are most likely to democratize are countries with a history of democracy and somewhat functional institutions. But the problem is that these functional institutions also generate military effectiveness. So if you go to a country that is comparatively more likely to turn into a democracy, it's going to be more costly to win that war. So you can either fight an easy war and have a low chance of democratization, or you can fight a hard war and have a higher chance of democratization. But since hard war can mean 100,000 casualties, who wants to do that? Usually people don't.
Right. So in other words, these presidents of democratic institutions in the West, for example, the American one, with this example of supporting, going to Uzbekistan and turning a blind eye to some of those atrocities, because it also helps the dictator that he now has a negotiating power with America, because he's lent some of his airstrips there so that, it's in America's interest to bomb Afghanistan. Now, this is geopolitics, is there? I mean, how does one The pitch by the president, in this case of America, to his audience, to his country will be, all right, for now, your lives are at risk if we don't do this. So for a moment, let's forget Uzbekistan, lives in Uzbekistan. Is that how it works?
Yes. I think democratic leaders tend to make the assumption that they can't level with their voters. You can't stand up and say, look, really what happens in Uzbekistan is not all that important to us. But, these people in Afghanistan could be a serious threat. So we're going to ignore what happens in Afghanistan and we're just going to use those airfields in order to advance our interests in Afghanistan. It doesn't work like that. So you have to come up with something. And that's why a lot of times they do talk about democracy. But I would also add, that for all the cynicism and for all the bad in the world, even though these democracies are imperfect, they're still our best hope. And that's also part of the reason why people, when they do strive for freedom and they do strive democracy, these are the actors that they appeal to. So, the Europeans, the Americans, the Australians, they pursue their interest. They will lie about what they do. But there's a reason why freedom-loving people everywhere still try to appeal to them as opposed to the Russians or the Chinese, right? So, yes, they're not perfect, but they're the least bad we have.
Yes. And when it comes to making those trade-offs, there is an interesting anecdote in the book where you talk about, please help me with this story, where was there one German conglomerate who had won a big deal?
So one of the things that I looked at in the book are rebellions. So in the book, I go through all of the ways that these tyrants can lose power. So you've got your coups, you've got your assassination attempts, and you've got your rebellions, for example. And if you're a rebel group, you need men, you need weapons, and you need money. Because if you want to, have people march, they need to be fed, and they might also need some sort of salary, if only to look after their family. And one of the ways in which these rebel groups make money is to take people hostage and extort them, essentially, to get that money coming in that they need for their fight. So one of the stories I tell is of a German conglomerate that gets a contract in South America. And, they start working. They're supposed to help with a pipeline. And what happens is that their employees get taken hostage by a rebel group. And, you're this manager now. You get that call. And now you have to decide what are you going to do. Either you pay the money. And if you pay the money, you are helping the rebellion grow, potentially. And you're doing something illegal. And by strengthening this rebel group, you might run into more trouble in the future. But if you don't do it, your employees are going to be at immediate risk. And obviously, it's not going to be the last time that your people get kidnapped. So if you want to complete that project on time, you're going to have an issue if, every 2 weeks, one of your people gets kidnapped. So eventually what they decided to do is to pay the ransom. And they got their people back. And they had kind of, an implicit deal going on with this rebel group that allowed them to make progress with their project. But the downside of this was that the rebel group grew. And they kept growing because it was an effective mechanism. And this, of course, is a problem that not just companies run into, but also something that governments run into. Often you hear, we're not going to negotiate with terrorists. And the reason why governments say that is because they're worried that if they do negotiate with terrorists and they do pay ransom, for example, for these hostages, then the terrorists have an incentive to do it again and again and again and again. But this is the kind of thing that sounds good in theory, but then in practice, if your people are taken hostage and there's no way to get them out through force, if you are the person making that decision, it's not an easy one.
Yeah, and what I found interesting was that all of this was taken as cost of doing business on both sides. This outfit, the rebel outfit, gave out stickers that were stuck on the lorries and jeeps of the German conglomerate's vehicles. So people knew that, okay, these are protected folks, let's not attack them. So it was very much a done thing.
Yeah, and it was good for the rebel group in multiple ways, because those stickers made sure that the conglomerate with which they had this sort of thing going on would then not be attacked. But also you're signaling to the local population that you're bringing in money, right? You're bringing in cash, you're doing something for the locals. Obviously, it's maybe not the best way to earn money, but there are areas in the world where it's pretty much the only way to really make money.
And talking about money, one of the frequently used strategies to stop dictators is to impose sanctions, which is to do with money. And so tell us in simple words what sanctions are and how effective are they?
Yes, sometimes, when people talk about sanctions as they relate to dictatorships, they think that the mechanisms by which they can succeed is to convince the dictator to step down. that doesn't work, because if you ask a dictator to step down, you're effectively asking him to sign his own death certificate. So no sanction in the world is going to convince a dictator to step down directly. But the way that they can work is by changing the incentives of the elites around the dictator that keep the dictator in power. Because again, you are the dictatorship. You can ignore the vast majority of the population, but there's a small share of the population for which you need to create positive results. Your generals, your intelligence officials, your advisors. So if money no longer comes in because some trade route is shut down or because of sanctions, for example, the pie gets smaller and smaller, but people still want to eat. And if you can no longer get that money to these soldiers and these intelligence officials, you might run into trouble. And when you run into trouble, it could be that the elites try to persuade you to change course because they want the money back, or they may decide that they want to topple you because they see that as the only way to get back to the previous situation.
And does that, have there been instances where this has helped a great deal, or does it slow things down and buy time so that other things can be put in place? How do countries use this? Because I think you've got one more section in the book where you say Americans, was it Bill Clinton who said that we've become a sanction nation or some such, where the only thing we do is slap sanctions, and 5 a day is what we have in the recent times, is what American president sanctions or some such. What does does it slow things down, or is there anything more to it?
It depends. So we know from the literature that there are some regimes that are better able to deal with outside sanctions than others. So one obvious example are military juntas. So military dictatorships can often deal with sanctions comparatively well, because when the sanctions hit and people get unhappy, they are quite good at using repression, right? So yeah, people might be unhappy, but you can jail them or you can shoot them. They're probably going to be okay on average. And the other type of regime that tends to be comparatively good at dealing with sanctions are regimes that have access to natural resources like oil. And the reason for that is that oil is such a valuable commodity that somebody's always going to buy it. Sanctions might force you to sell it at a discount, but somebody's going to buy. And this is also what we see with Russia right now. Yeah, it gets labeled differently. Perhaps it goes through some other country, and then, they might make less money, but they are going to keep making money. And that, of course, is depressing, because a lot of the regimes that we might want to use sanctions against are also regimes that have these natural resources, and that reduces the effectiveness. That said, one way to look at sanctions is that even though they might not change behavior directly, they make it more difficult for these regimes to operate. And sometimes that's better than nothing.
Yeah. And the last couple of questions in the interest of time. You have a section around data, how countries are today using data to find cues as to how these countries with dictators run. Can you expound on that? How is data and analytics helping the whole cause?
Yeah, there's a lot more data available now, and there are also better ways to use that data. So one of the examples I provide in the book is to look at the economic power of North Korea. So when you look at a nighttime map of the Korean Peninsula, what you see is that the south is very bright. You look at Seoul, it's literally, the sort of metropolitan area of Seoul is like a ball of light, essentially. And then you see the border, and the northern half of the peninsula is almost all black. You got a little bit of brightness, but it's almost all black. And that relates to economic activity. So what social scientists have started to do is to divide the entire peninsula into these little squares, and they measure the light intensity within those squares in order to find out how much is going on. So the brighter these little squares are, the more economic activity there is. And with some numbers magic, you can try to use that to estimate North Korean GDP, because all of these dictatorial regimes lie about their GDP and about just about any other official figure. And in addition to that, you've got foreign ministries that try to use analytics in order to predict election-related violence. You've got intelligence services on trying to predict coup d'etat. So there's a lot going on in the background to try to, make sense of these dictatorial regimes, because the data that we get from the regimes themselves is awful.
And this date, yes, exactly. You talk also about propaganda, right? Because these dictators will only show things on TV that they want their people to see, and so much so that the entire country can be misguided. So for example, what's happening in Ukraine, the Russians, I have no idea what kind of news they will be. They don't get the New York Times, for instance, I'm sure. So that truth or the lack of it is what these dictators thrive on, don't they? And so much so that the country can suffer. You write about Libya, where Gaddafi did not invest in science and education because he didn't want people to be more, whatever, intelligent than him, so that they'll topple him. So the whole country was suppressed in that sense. So it has very insidious effects.
Yes, dictators want to look strong. You know, they want to appear great. They want to be seen to be invincible because they want to avoid that scenario where they look weak, and as a result, people are able to imagine a different version of the country that might be democratic or at the very least not contain them. So they lie, and they make sure that everybody else lies as well. And you see that not just in newspapers getting suppressed, but, you know, journalists going to jail. Sometimes journalists just die. So, you know, free information is the natural enemy of the dictator. Yeah. And for that reason, people were really optimistic about the emergence of social media, especially during the time of the Arab Spring, because they thought, you know, now there's more information, it's easier to access, and as a result, all of these dictatorships will crumble. And since then, we've found out that these assessments were in many ways overly optimistic, because not only activists can use social media, but dictatorships can too. So, you know, they have bot profiles, you know, crawl social media sites in order to identify their opponents and then hunt them down. You know, they have sophisticated software in order to surveil their enemies' phones and all the rest of it. So, unfortunately, it can be used by both sides.
So when I hear all this, Marcel, I feel that it looks like North Korea, Kim Jong-un, has it all figured out, right? Because A, he won't allow people to have protests because he'll have them killed. B, nobody can film that. The reason, I mean, the whole idea is if you film it, if it goes on social media, people will know, they will come. And I don't think there are places like, I mean, they don't even have congregation grounds where people can stage protests. So people will not even bother with it because there is no way this information can spread. So in a way, I mean, that's the height of dictatorship, is that then?
Kim Jong-un is not going to be toppled by, you know, peaceful, non-violent protests because, like you say, there's really no way for people to come together. They can't mobilize. There's no free media. There's no free internet. And if you do protest, sometimes people get punished across generations. So it might not just be you that goes to a labor camp, but, you know, it might also be your children that go with you. So the conditions are so horrific that the price of openly opposing the regime is simply too high for people to try to do it. And even if they did, it probably wouldn't make a difference because there would be no way for it to really spread from one city to another. That said, I think the most impressive thing, I guess, that the North Korean regime has managed to do is to organize succession multiple times. Because as we talked about earlier, at the moment when one dictator dies, the regimes are often quite vulnerable and a lot of things can go wrong. And they've managed to do it multiple times now, passing on that power from generation to generation. That said, it doesn't mean that Kim Jong-un is invulnerable. So one thing that dictators always have to worry about is their health. And not just because, obviously, they don't want to die, just like anybody else. But what can happen is that if dictators show some kind of sign of illness, it can get the people around them to reevaluate their behavior because the incentives change. Are not just interested in supporting somebody that is in power now or next year, but you want to support somebody who's also going to be in power in 5 years. But if, let's say, you're a dictator with an incredibly unhealthy diet, you might not move much. You might start to have, health problems because you look the way that Kim Jong-un does, and something about his health condition leaks. That might mean that those generals and those intelligence officers change their calculus and decide to support somebody else. And it doesn't have to be a lot at first, but maybe more and more decide to provide some support in the background. And just like that, dictators can fall. And that is part of the reason why dictators are so obsessed with keeping anything related to their health private, right? That's part of the reason why they will go to foreign clinics and they will suppress that information because they do not want that information to leak, because if it does, they can die a lot quicker than any illness could kill it.
Wow, it's all fascinating. Marcel, last one is when you studied, you've done your PhD on the subject. It's taken you so many years of research. Do some things still, blow your mind as an expert on the subject, which is like, man, this is incredible. I mean, even you didn't calculate it because pretty much everything in the book for me was a first time read. But for you, what stands out saying, man, this is at a different level altogether?
Yeah, I mean, I have those moments sometimes, for the book, for example. I talk to some pretty unusual people. I mean, coup plotters, spies. I talked to an alleged war criminal, for example. And, sometimes you're in these calls and you really ask yourself, what, where did I sort of go wrong to be in this situation now? So I remember talking to one man who was allegedly responsible for some really, really terrible war crimes. I mean, people getting burned to death, people getting shot. He allegedly had responsibility for it. And I was in that call, and, when you talk to people, you say, oh, it's nice to meet you. And as soon as I said it in that call, I thought, but is it? Is it nice to meet you? Is this nice? So I've read a lot, I've seen a lot, I've talked to a lot of people, but every now and then, or you read about something, or you meet somebody and you really stop to think, wow, this is truly terrible. So yeah, I guess I am still surprised in a way sometimes.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Marcel, for your time on this podcast, and congratulations yet again on Why Tyrants Fall.
Thank you very much for having me. Have a good day.
You too.